Hi everyone, Matt here from Proof Fly Fishing. In this video we are going to prep our wraps for rod finish or for thread finish, and then we're actually going to seal the wraps. But before we get started with the actual sealing, I want to kind of run through some of the materials we're going to be using and some of the tools, things you want to have in place before we get started. We're going to be using Threadmaster Light on this build. Threadmaster comes in both a light and a regular. Both of them work great. I tend to use the light on rods that are 5 weight and below, and the regular on rods that are 6 weight and up. But again, both of them work great. One thing I recommend, and I mentioned this earlier, are these self-sealing inserts, and I just want to show you how those work. We're going to be using syringes to extract equal parts of the two finishes, of the two components here, to mix. And you want to get that finish as close to equal as possible. So what these inserts do, they just fit in the top of these bottles. You push them into place. And you just got to kind of push them down as hard as you can. And when they're installed, what you have then is an airtight, watertight seal. So you can flip the bottle upside down. You let all the air that's in that bottle rise to the top. And then you just take your insert, or excuse me, you take your syringe and you insert it into the bottom of that bottle. And now you can extract that rod finish without any air, and you can get a perfect amount without any mess. So in this case, I'm going to pull 2 cc's out of this bottle, and then I'm just going to put it right into this plastic cup. And then we're going to do the same for the other bottle. Threadmaster usually has a foil seal. Just remove that and then push your insert in place. And again, flip it upside down to get all the air out of the way. Excuse me. Insert your syringe, and regardless of how much you use, just make sure it's exactly the same as the last one. Just like that. Some people like to warm their finish up. If you want to do that, to keep any bubbles from forming, that's not a bad idea. So what you can do is just get like a coffee cup with some warm water and put these in it for, I don't know, a couple minutes until it comes up to temperature. Once you have the equal parts, what we're going to try to do is we're going to stir this very carefully. I'm using a metal spatula. The reason I'm not using like a popsicle stick is because it's porous, and it's going to introduce small air bubbles into the finish as I mix it. So I'm using a metal spatula. I'm also using a silicone-free plastic cup. The syringes are silicone-free, the brushes are silicone-free. What happens if you get silicone in the mix is it interferes with the finish and how it cures. You can get shimmers, you can get what are called fish eyes in it. It just doesn't look nice. So at all costs, avoid silicone when it comes to thread finish. When we start mixing, we've got the 2 parts in there. I tip the cup, and then using the spatula, I kind of come underneath the mixture. And the reason I'm doing that is because I'm minimizing air bubbles by not traveling through the center of it. So I come through the bottom, and I lift up, come through the bottom, and I'm going to do this. I'm going to mix this for 2 minutes. And if you get a little air bubbles in there, it's not going to be a big deal. We can get rid of those later, but do your best to minimize the amount of air bubbles when you mix it. So a good mixing, you can rotate that cup a little bit, and after 2 minutes of constant mixing, your finish should be ready to go. If you do get air bubbles in there, again, don't worry too much about it. We're going to deal with those a little bit later if they happen to transfer onto your wraps. But that's all there is to mixing thread finish. In a minute, we're going to do a close-up, and we're going to show you how we apply that to wraps. But what I also wanted to talk about are some other tools that are going to be helpful to have on hand. So when we apply the finish and when we prep our wraps, we're just going to have our rod wrapping jig. We're going to keep the rod cradled in it, and just like when we were wrapping a guide, we're going to center the guide in the jig when we apply the rod finish. Now, if you have a turner, some people are going to have a rod turner or a rod dryer. You can go ahead and put the blank or the rod, or one or two sections of the rod, into that and start rotating it, which is another way to apply finish. But I want to minimize the amount of equipment, so I'm going to show you how to do finish without using a rod dryer. So what you'll want to do too is have a thread burnisher handy. We're going to use that, and I'll show you again in a close-up how to polish the thread, make sure it's nice and smooth, and then if there are any bumps, if like a tag end of the thread is sticking through, we'll deal with that after the first coat of thread finish is on, so you don't have to worry too much about that at this point. So just make sure you have everything you need all set. You've got your jig set up or your rod turner. You've got your rod. In a minute we're going to show you how to prep those wraps. And then after everything's ready, that's when you actually measure out your thread finish and get it mixed up. And depending on temperature, this finish will stay good for, I don't know, 8, sometimes 12, 15 minutes. And then it'll start to thicken up on you a little bit, and you'll want to mix up a new batch. Just because you won't get a nice, it'll stop self-leveling, you'll get kind of globs that'll go on, and it just won't look good on your wraps. It also won't release air in the event that there are some bubbles. So we're going to switch to a close-up, and we're going to walk you through sealing thread. And your first rod, first couple rods at least, don't worry about getting it perfect. Chances are your edges aren't going to be perfectly crisp on the, where the thread meets the blank, or on the other side underneath the guide foot. But on this first rod, we're learning, so just make sure you get good coverage. Chances are, once you fish this rod a couple times, you'll forget all about it. You'll never notice, no one else will ever notice, and with time and with practice, you'll be able to kind of clean those wraps up and your finish will improve. So let's switch to a close-up and show you how to apply thread finish. Okay, we're back here. We've got our epoxy mixed up and our wraps have been prepped. Now, with nylon, there's not a whole lot of prep you need to do. I make sure that my tag ends are cut as close as I can get them. And if I see any fuzzies, what I can do is take my burnishing tool and just rub it over top of them to kind of polish and flatten those out. Anytime you're dealing with a material that's going around a blank, you can break some of those microscopic fibers, and so it's not a bad idea just to kind of polish those wraps lightly. If you do have trim bands, just be very careful that you don't kind of push them away from the main band or the main wrap. Just make sure everything's nice and tight when you finish that. Again, with nylon you don't have to go overboard. We'll do a later video with silk, and silk can be a little more finicky. But once you're happy, once your wraps look smooth and clean and tight, we're going to go ahead and grab a little bit of our epoxy. I like to use a sable hair brush. Some people like disposable brushes, some people like to even use a spatula to apply epoxy, but I like the kind of narrow edge that these sable brushes have. And although we're using a brush, we are not painting the finish on the wrap. What we're doing is using the edge of that brush to kind of push it around. So we're going to apply some to the center of the wrap, and then using that brush we're going to push it out to the edges as we rotate that rod. And we're going to go both directions. Again, we're just using the brush to push the finish around. Finish is kind of like dubbing in some ways for those of you who tie. The tendency when you're starting off is to use way more than you actually need. So a couple thin coats is what we're going for. What we want to avoid is a wrap that has an excessive amount of epoxy on it, such that when it's dry, it looks like a football. We want a nice, tight, narrow finish on these guides. So again, you can see I'm just kind of putting small dabs in the center of finish, and then I'm pushing those out to the edge of the wrap. Now, a lot of builders too will obsess over getting clean edges. Now, if I got a little excess, I can just take my brush and wipe that off, just like that. And I'm not sure if you can see it in the video or not, but there's a couple small bubbles in here. There's one right there. It looks like a white dot in the video. And what we can do, and again, it's going to look a little silly, but you just kind of get real close to the wrap and breathe onto it, and those bubbles will release. Another thing you can do is kind of like coax those out, like that bubble just disappeared. So did that one. One thing too, if you're working on a stripping guide, you're going to have a larger gap where the guide foot goes under the wrap right there, and we call that a tunnel. And so what you want to do on a larger guide, this is a pretty small snake guide, but you can take like a needle. Some people use like a toothpick with a little bit of finish on it, and very carefully just place that right where the guide goes underneath the thread. And what's going to happen is you're going to get the capillary effect, and that tunnel is going to suck in that finish and fill that void. But it might take a couple applications to do it. So again, on this side, we're just starting with a small amount of epoxy in the center of the wrap, and we're using that brush to push it to the edges. Some builders like to go onto the blank a little bit too. And then if you want to do that, it's a nice idea to have a brush, excuse me, where you can start a little bead of finish on the end of that brush, and then hold it very steady and rotate the rod to get a nice clean line around it. So again, just dealing with small amounts of finish here. And as we go, we're just spreading it out and adding more as needed. And what's nice about this finish is that it's self-leveling, which means once we're done applying it, and we're going to rotate this rod by hand for a little bit, that finish is going to level itself out. So there's not going to be any big clumps, assuming we've applied it well. And again, we're going for a thin coat. When I'm done, I like to kind of pull off any excess like that. Excuse me. So there we go. And again, if you have any microscopic bubbles, just get real close to that wrap and breathe onto it as you rotate it, and those bubbles will release. So once you get these guides done, once you have everything finished, and it might take a couple pots of finish. You know, this stuff will only last, depending on temperature and humidity, 8, sometimes 12, maybe a few more minutes. Once it starts to thicken up such that it doesn't go on easy, you'll notice it. Go ahead and mix up a new pot, and don't be afraid to use multiple batches of finish to coat one rod. But once everything's done, you can leave it right in your rod wrapping jig, and then set a timer for 15 minutes, and every 15 minutes we're going to do a quarter rotation. And then 15 more minutes, another quarter. Just like that with the whole rod. What I usually do, I'll just throw on a movie or something, or if I'm watching a game, I'll leave it in the rack in front of me and then set a timer, and every 15 minutes I'll just rotate it. And you want to do that for around 2 hours. Again, it's going to depend somewhat on temperature as far as how long it takes that epoxy to set. But what's nice is that you have your container of epoxy that you can kind of test with a toothpick or something. And you can see this stuff is fresh and it's running off the toothpick. But in a couple hours, this stuff will be hard. It'll be tacky, and then it'll start to get real hard after that. All you needed to do is really tack up to the point where it doesn't flow anymore, and you should be all set. No need to do that for like 5 or 6 hours. One of the last things I wanted to show you is once you get the rod done, now these wraps are in need of some help. I want to show you some common things that'll happen. Now you might get your wrap done and the next day you pick it up and you run your finger over it and you feel something kind of sharp or a lump there. What's happened, more than likely, this one's kind of an exaggerated thing. You can see it on the bottom there. There's that thread that I left badly uncut right there. So if you have a tag end, even a small one sometimes will get stuck in that epoxy and form like a little lump. So what you want to do is take your razor blade and you can come in there and try not to, don't cut the main wrap, but just come in and shear off that lump and a little bit of the finish that's around it. And this one's kind of a mess. I did this wrap to kind of show you a few problems that can arise. But just come in there and just shear that finish off, just like that. And this one looks a little rough right now, but what we're going to do is apply another thin coat of epoxy over top of that. And those bumps and imperfections will just disappear on us. So again, we're just going right over the areas that we kind of cleaned up. And once that levels out and cures a bit, we should be all set. The last thing is as far as number of coats. It kind of depends on the size of the blank you're doing. If I'm using Threadmaster Light, like I'm using on these wraps, I usually go for 2 coats. You know, once you get a little more comfortable and you can work a little more finish onto the wrap, you might be able to get it done in 1 coat. But what you'll have, I like a real thin wrap. I like thin finish on my guides. And so what you'll notice when it cures is that you might see a little bit of the texture of the thread still showing through. And if that's the case, then I would apply another coat of finish. But yeah, 2 coats usually for Threadmaster Light. If you're using the regular build, you might be able to get it done in 1. But that's the basics of wrapping, or excuse me, of finishing. Again, be patient with yourself. You know, your wraps might not look perfect. The finish, this is kind of the part that most people sweat the most. But you know, do your best and try not to use too much finish. That's going to be the best advice I can give you when you're starting off. Smaller amounts, do more coats so you can control that finish. You know where it is. And then just make sure you rotate it long enough. Check your pot of finish to check the consistency of it. That way you're not touching your wraps and leaving a fingerprint. But I think that's it. So in the next video, we are going to install the reel seat, and the final video after that, we're just going to talk about a few things about how to fix wraps in the event that you need to cut one off or touch it up further. So, all right, thank you.